Jonathan, thank you. As ever, provocative, challenging, but hugely enjoyable as well. We do have about 25 minutes or so for questions because we did think that there would be lots you would want to respond to. So I will try and repeat your question so we capture it for the recording. So who would like to begin? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, taking it right back to the very beginning almost, how do you define sustainability?
So,
what's your definition of sustainability?
Jonathan's definition of sustainability. We've only got 25 minutes.
At its simplest, living as if we hoped that human life would continue forever on this planet. And without getting into the whole intergenerational stuff, what one generation owes the next, there's still a story about how we use the earth and how we relate to each other, which will tell you we're either heading off in a more or less sustainable direction. I've always used sustainable development as a process, and I've used the concept of sustainability as a directional place which we're heading towards. The only other bit that I would add to that is if it isn't about social justice as much as it's about biophysical sustainability, honestly it isn't worth listening to. I know that because we had a real run-in during the election campaign. Natalie Bennett and Caroline Lucas got really viciously attacked by an excellent, eccentric academic at Cambridge called Peter Wadhams, who accused the Green Party of betraying green politics by spending too much time talking about poverty and austerity and social justice and not enough time talking about the physical environment and climate change. Now, if you did see the leaders' debate, you'll know that Natalie Bennett tried to mention climate change before instantaneously being brushed aside by whoever it was who was moderating that debate. And the Green Party made a number of different efforts to get climate change into the election debate, but with no effect. But this is just the most stupid debate in the world. How can anybody think we can address climate change on a global basis without a 100% commitment to a fairer economy which enables people to live better lives than they live today? I just don't understand where anybody could be coming from. I know he's a climate scientist, but...
Okay, the whom says it all. I think we'll take this question here and then we'll come here.
Do you think there's a place for sustainable nuclear power, given the Green Party's anti-nuclear stance?
A place for sustainable nuclear power, Jonathan?
I've shared one or two oxymorons with you today, as in sustainable growth and sustainable nuclear power. That's
It doesn't burn dinosaurs.
It's as much of an oxymoron as anything else if uranium remains your source of feedstock, as it were. How cross do I want to be?
Feel free to be as cross as you would like, Jonathan.
Honestly, I'm not pro-nuclear. I'm not pro-nuclear. I never have been. But the debate is kind of over. In many respects, it's over because you look at the things that ought to gladden your heart in terms of the possibility of sustainable energy for all. And I just listened to a brilliant speech from this guy called Jun Keller, who is the Director General for the Sustainable Energy for All scheme under the United Nations. And he was just brilliant. He went hard on efficiency, on renewables, on solar, on smart decentralized grids. And he said all of this stuff is emerging all the time. He even mentioned innovation in storage technologies. Now, not many people get excited about that. I do, because it really is very exciting. And you look at all these innovation stories emerging. You look at cost curves coming down. You look at availability. You look at opportunity to enable people in the poor world as well as in the rich world. And honestly, nuclear now is all but irrelevant. Even if we did press ahead with the Hinkley Point reactors, which I don't think we will, by the way, and they will be the most expensive the most expensive power stations anywhere in the world by a massive margin. we wouldn't be generating any electricity from them until 2024, 25 at the earliest. If you look at Flamanville or Kyoto, they're 8 years behind time, etc., etc. Even if we got to that point, the reduction in the cost, particularly of solar and wind, will just make these white elephants completely irrelevant. Honestly, completely irrelevant. Now, maybe we'll get some really smart new nuclear technology. Some people bang on about thorium and small modular reactors and various other things that keep spinning in people's heads. Fine. I think personally, I think it's a waste of time to do much research in this area. But to be fair, I've always said where you have a legitimate research need, continue to research it just to see whether or not there is some way in which nuclear might eventually, at the end of the day, become useful to us. I seriously don't believe it will, because we've got a perfectly adequate fusion reactor already serving planet Earth. And if we just get really, really smart at using that fusion reactor, I think conventional nuclear technologies become totally redundant.
I suppose it's following on from that, the angle, but how much do you feel that new technologies can make us sustainable? They've made us unsustainable, but how much can they make us sustainable? And I'm thinking particularly things like GM crops for a growing population.
So how can new technologies contribute to a more sustainable future?
Well, massively. And I gave a talk in Bristol last week, which Martin was at, where I bared my soul a bit and said I never used to be terribly interested in technology because it just didn't seem terribly interesting. To be honest, some people love technologies, some people it's sort of up there and doing either good things or not very good things, and I never really spent any time looking at technology really close up. And then I wrote this book called The World We Made about the year 2050, and I thought, well, I'd better find out what's happening around all these technologies. And yes, I've become a bit of a devotee for the impact of sustainable technology on prospects for the human species, particularly in the fields of energy and food production, manufacturing, materials, science, and so on. I think it's incredible what's beginning to happen. The speed of change is dramatic, and particularly in energy, because I for part of the research for this book, I visited a number of solar institutes in the world and just was completely blown away by the speed with which this technology is now promising a total revolution in our understanding of how energy systems work, coupled with storage, which is why storage is so important. I noticed that you ended so count me in now, a bit late in the day, as a kind of sustainability activist. Count me in as a technology enthusiast, okay? I haven't been saying that very often. It still feels a bit odd to say it because I'm still a bit nervous that people just get fixated by technology and then they don't think about structures and governance and justice and all the rest of it. And I've noticed that people who are most enthusiastic about technology are the people who are most keen to forget the whole of the rest of what makes life work for people. Peter Diamandis, for instance, brilliant Californian cornucopian who promises the world to 9 billion people off the back of technology change in his book Abundance, and do read it if you've got a gloomy mood coming on. It is absolutely staggering. Not a single mention in that book about how power politics works, about distribution, about unfairness in the global economy. Not one. Now, that's what worries me about cornucopians, okay? They tend to have blind spots everywhere. So they've got this single issue. I'm just staring at this light now. They've got this single issue about smart tech, and the rest of the story remains invisible. And then, of course, you stuck GM on the end there. You see, that's what happens. I'm fascinated today that the only way you can be deemed to be pro-technology as a greenie is if you're in favour of nuclear and in favour of GM. Where did these twin evil sisters come from that they should rule the roost in terms of proof points that you are pro-technology? So I'm saying I am now pro-technology, okay? And I'll learn soon to do that without having to qualify it so that it almost disappears. Count me as one of those. But really, I am not going to sign up unthinkingly to a nuclear story about technology shift and a GM story. Look, let's not do GM fully today. GM may or may not have a contribution to make to helping feed the world on a genuinely sustainable basis. I don't know. It's been promised throughout my life as a campaigner. It's still being promised, a bit like the nuclear dream, you know, fusion reactor. When's that going to be ready? Oh, another 40 years. Oh, good, okay. Still another 40 years. And GM probably will have a contribution to make. But why did you not put your question to me? So, Jonathan, you're now pro-technology. What do you think about that amazing suite of technologies that are helping create new strains of different crops through different selective breeding techniques, including things like the use of selective markers and so on in the genomes of different critical crops, which we need to find. We need to increase the productivity. Why didn't you ask me that instead of asking me about GM? Because, you see, I think people have got a fetish about GM, and not you, obviously, sir, but I think people have got a fetish about GM, and they see it as a kind of mark of where you are in the debate, and nobody ever talks about the brilliant things being done with accelerated selective breeding. So, simple story. If you want to check this out, do check this out, because I only have it on second opinion because I'm not an expert. If you look at the crops that have already been improved to help deal with saline incursion in farmland, most of the development of the crops that are already being grown in those areas have come through accelerated selective breeding, not through GM. Not through GM. And they're already bringing benefits to, I don't know, millions and millions of people in areas that are suffering from saline incursion of one kind or another. You never hear about it. It's bloody brilliant. It's bloody brilliant. You never hear about it. All we hear about is GM is going to make the difference and save the world. I see. It doesn't add up for me.
Should we move on from GM?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, over here, and then we're going there, then we're going there. Possibly the last question at the back, but over here first.
Hi, thank you. The classic sort of rally call for environmentalism is think global, act local. And I just wondering what role for the local in solving some of these issues, and particularly local activism, non-government organizations. I noticed they aren't on the list in our areas of hope. So what is the role for sort of local and sort of non-governmental activity outside of that? Yeah,
Good point.
The role of local NGO and other activists.
Well, let's just separate this out a tiny bit, okay, because civil society, let's just start there as your construct. I think civil society is clearly going to be a very important part of the way in which sustainability can be brought alive for people. And for me, some of the really big stories are going to be around things like community energy. Most people don't really want to buy into the notion of a low-carbon future or a decarbonisation trajectory for their community. Honestly, this doesn't really get people going very much. But community energy schemes, which are visible, directly beneficial, beginning to make a real difference, and replicable at an increasingly low cost, absolutely the way to go at the community level. Practical rollout of things that make a difference is, I think, the way in which we can do this. And Bristol, in fact, is a really good example of this. I mean, Bristol bristles with community schemes of one kind or another, and it's an astonishing sort of outpouring of creativity and local activism and commitment, many of which don't last very long, but they all contribute to that overall sense there's a space here, we can fill a bit of it, and it's going to be positive. So I think that's really important. The role of NGOs, that's a difficult question. I hesitate to get into this debate right now. I think some of our NGOs here in the UK have sort of lost their way a bit. I have reflected on this in the past. It makes me very unpopular, so I have to be a little bit careful how I say this. But honestly, when I look at what the NGOs did over the last 5 years to hold this bloody coalition government to account for what is now revealed as a pretty astonishingly destructive attack on much of the legislation and the systems that keep the environment going, hardly a peep. You look at institutional attacks on the Environment Agency, Natural England. These are agencies that have been not quite hollowed out yet, but boy, Natural England, it's got massive statutory responsibilities. It's a third smaller than it was at the start of the coalition government. It's hardly able to do what it needs to do. And the conservation organisations honestly don't really seem to think this matters hugely. Now, I think this matters hugely, and I am a bit worried about how our NGOs are off the pace of getting a difficult government to feel less comfortable about the bad things that it's doing. That's really what I think they need to do now, personally. Sorry.
As environmental activists, sustainability practitioners, academics, it can get pretty exhausting, pretty tiring, pretty despairing. You are still incredibly alive and passionate and inspired. What's your secret?
Your secret, Jonathan. As you keep going, what motivates you?
Well,
despite the evidence in front of you
yes,
from time to time.
It's a good movement to be part of, you know. I mean, the sustainability world is full of so many astonishing people doing things on the right side of history, as I would see it, both in a paid capacity and the millions of volunteers. I mean, we hardly ever celebrate this story about volunteerism here in the UK. One of the things I do now, I'm president of an NGO, which I obviously wasn't criticising, called the Conservation Volunteers. It used to be called British Trust for Conservation Volunteers, and they lost the British bit and the trust bit. But no, not the trust bit, that's still there. But TCV is an amazing organisation, and I look at the role that TCV and groundwork play in the lives of millions of people at the grassroots level, and it's staggering. It's absolutely staggering. So this is a wonderful world to be in. It's a privilege to be part of this particular socially progressive world. So I draw on the inspiration that I get from those people all the time in the most outrageous way. And that keeps a lot of my energy levels going. I'm also kind of a bit of a tree hugger. And for me, access to the natural world and enjoyment of the natural world, I'm going straight here to another campus, UE campus, to look at an exhibition that some of you may not even have heard of here, on sacred trees, which I heard about by accident. I thought, well, I'm here, of course, forgetting that actually I'm not really here because it's the other side of Bristol. But anyway, so I thought I'll just pop over the road and dip in and have a look at this exhibition. You see, things like sacred trees really matters to me, and I spend quite a lot of time engaged in that side of the green world, which is very different from the material, science-driven world that I spend most of my time in. But that kind of really makes a difference to me.
For information, the Sacred Trees exhibition is on the Bower Ashton campus. So, right.
You talked about the Labour Party leadership candidates mimicking a soft conservatism, and I wondered whether you saw a vacuum in our society for more radical politics, including an approach to sustainability like Podemos in Spain, given the right kind of inspirational leadership, or do you analyse the last election results with the thrifty UKIP, which is rightwards, as indicating we don't have this potential within our society for more radical politics?
Is there a space in British electoral politics for a more sustainably oriented political party?
Good question. I don't know. And I don't know, because we don't really know what that would look like any longer, other than what the Green Party brings, sometimes quite falteringly, into the political space. And it's worrying, because that means that so much of the electorate is now so unfamiliar with what would sound like an even passingly progressive alternative, let alone a full-on bloody radical alternative, the kind that I think would, make people's toes curl up. And we confront a media story out there which is so hostile to anything more radical. I don't know. I'm a member of the Green Party, and I suspect I always will be. I am really fascinated, and I'm starting to speculate a bit about this. The Lib Dems, it seems to me, are going to have to reinvent themselves. There are going to be many, many people in the Labour Party who are going to look at this election saying, oh, for the next leader, here we go again, another bloody, can I call them? Pro-liberalisation, pro-capitalist politician who will just toe the bloody line, sycophantically suck up to the bloody bankers all over again. You just think, there have got to be some people still in the Labour Party who think, I don't think that's quite what it's all about. I really think there are. So I'm speculating a tiny bit now about the possibility of the Green Party reconstituting Liberal Democrat Party, and the progressive, what's left of progressive politics in the Labour Party, having exactly the same sort of thought in their own mind that you've just had, which is to say, are we really going to make any difference in the next election? Because you know what's going to happen. Cameron will fix the seats. There won't be any electoral reform. We'll go into that election pretty much on the same cephalological basis as we've come out of this one. No prospect, to be honest, of getting a more radical voice heard at the next election than there was at this one. And you might have an awful lot of people in those three parties who will say, time for something different. Time for something different. We're going to just think differently about this. And the key here is the Lib Dems. Because what would you do? How do you come back from what's happened to them? And you either come back in a way that says, this is what liberalism in this country still means, or you come back and say, no, we'll split the difference between these two neoliberal parties, which is the sort of Nick Clegg approach to. So I think that's going to be the test. Very important who gets elected. Norman Lamb, Tim Farron, two different political parties. Sorry.
Okay, we've got one there. Gentleman in the...
Shall we take both together and I'll
and then
synthesise?
Okay, so Nick.
I didn't know this was going to happen. This turns out to be a supplementary to Vicky's question. If you were talking to Natalie Bennett and advising her, would you like her to go deeper or paler green? Tactically, strategically, in the light of, my question was going to be about, in the light of the hope associated with the young people that are largely attributable, associated with the Green Party.
Yeah. Do you want to take them together?
Yeah.
So the gentleman next to Andy.
Thank you. Have you engaged the WI and those organisations like that, who are the only ones who have blooded the nose of the politicians so far?
Okay. And then...
Well, it's related, really. I mean, you know, Paul Dorfman and others have been with him trying to convince MPs about the cost of nuclear power, thinking that was the easy argument to win, and yet they're totally uninterested. So the question is, how do you get MPs to actually care about the environment?
So I think that's quite enough for you to try and get in. You've got about 6 minutes left, Jonathan. Or 6 years.
Okay. I think the question about the WI is fascinating because it is true that they have had an impact. It's true that when they go into coalition with other organisations to protest about something, whether that's Antarctica, because the WI had a really, sounds so odd, doesn't it, a really marked effect on the government by joining the campaign to strengthen some of the provisions around the Antarctic Treaty, or some of the issues closer to home here in the UK. It's true that they have a big impact. And I take a Jerusalem-type approach to the Women's Institute, which is to say that this is an extraordinary spectrum of women in that social force. And many of those women are extremely progressive and radical, even though they probably wouldn't wear those badges when they go out and talk to people. And from my own personal experience of the Women's Institute, which is small but always interesting, feisty feminism is alive and well in the Women's Institute. And wherever you take this debate about the future of politics, it is likely to be a form of politics that is absolutely unflinching in its commitment to a way of life that addresses women's issues much more proactively than we do today. When I look at the story about violence to women here in the UK, let alone anywhere else in the world, I think it's staggering that we somehow think we have a civilization. It is absolutely staggering, this completely institutionalized form of violence against women through society in so many different ways. And there isn't going to be a form of sustainable politics that doesn't address that head on. What better organisation to spearhead that than the Women's Institute? So sorry, it's got to be the Greens, the Lib Dems, bits, the rump of radical Labour and the Women's Institute. That's sounding like an interesting coalition coming together right here. Advice to Natalie Bennett. I don't think there's any point in green politics that doesn't spell it out as it is. It's often uncomfortable and people don't like it. The Green Party talks about population, for instance. Most people just, don't talk to me about that. The Green Party talks about alternatives to growth, for instance, which most people don't want to engage in at all. The Green Party isn't out there articulating that which is almost impossible to articulate in our current political orthodoxy. It doesn't have any value at all. And for me, therefore, they need to keep the story rolling as a radical story about a transformed society, not a vaguely improved society. And in that respect, current MPs may be largely irrelevant to that. I mean, for me, Caroline Lucas is an extraordinary political leader. She's not actually leader of the Green Party, as you know, but she is an extraordinary politician. And when you look at how people respond to the quality of Caroline's leadership as an individual politician and as an exponent of green politics, small g, small p, not just the Green Party manifesto, the response is amazing. I mean, the response is amazing because she's clearly not just doing the bloody party line. She's thinking, responding, and in a way that is personal and empathetic. And again, green politics without empathy, without being able to step into and experience what life looks and feels like for people in different parts of the world, different walks of life, isn't going to get anywhere anyway. So I want to see all that stuff strengthened. I don't want to see the Green Party pulling back and saying, oh God, people didn't like that very much, so let's do it differently. Bloody hell, they liked it. There are more than 1 million votes, the Green Party. Look, I never got more than 782 votes when I stood as a candidate for the Green Party. I mean, this is bloody amazing for me to see an election result like this. You see? I can just find a silver lining in every cloud. It's remarkable. If you'd seen the votes I got back in the 70s and 80s, you'd know what I mean. So I think it's on the right path. I do think it's on the right path. I think it could get smarter about the way it deals with the media. You don't want to offer too many hostages to fortune in the way that the party tended to do in the last election. So MPs, questionable value to me, even though I mourn the loss of at least 20 really excellent Lib Dem MPs that I got to know personally, who were outstanding servants, public servants, in the role they played in their constituencies. Most of you wouldn't know them unless you were in a constituency where you had one of those MPs. They were exactly what good MPs should be like. But since you put this in the context of nuclear power, I will just say that the speed with which the Lib Dems decided that their historical opposition to nuclear power was no longer part of what it was to be a Liberal Democrat was remarkable and deeply, deeply cynical. And if Lib Dems start playing cynical games, we're all buggered. I mean, what's the point of being a Lib Dem and being cynical? I mean, it's just a complete contradiction in terms. So they tried to play the tough, hard-ass game of, well, you give a bit, you take a bit, you know, we do all this kind of stuff. And what did they lose in the process? They lost their soul. And I think that this is going to be a long recovery journey, therefore, for the Lib Dems. But the ones that will come back quickest, like my MP in Cheltenham, who got axed by some godforsaken Tory, who stayed absolutely true to the thinking of the Lib Dems, remained totally true to the opposition to nuclear power, constantly got up Nick Clegg's nose by making this point very, very clear all the way through the coalition government. People like that will come back because they've got an ethical core, they've got a base to the politics that they espouse. So I don't spend much time with MPs these days, it has to be said, because that can be depressing. There's another little hint. Don't spend too much time with MPs.
I know there's lots more questions, but Jonathan does have to get to the other side of the city. So I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say I've had a fascinating hour in Jonathan's company. We've had some really incisive comments, some wonderful responses to your questions. Please join me in thanking Jonathon.